Good afternoon. I'm not sure where you are from, so I guess have a good day. It's better. I'm Anastasia and I will be your host, but we still have some time before to start, so let's wait patiently. And remember to have, during the presentation, to have your microphones muted, so there will be a better reception for you guys. Right now, I'm going to give my voice over to Andreas. Andreas, are you ready?
I am ready, indeed.
So I hope that that the quick and short presentation about what we do as a company was helpful for you. And now for the main event, Andreas, I'm giving the rest to you. Your microphone is muted.
So that's better now.
Yes.
And I would like to share my screen. I am Andreas Grabitz. Please, if you have any questions to me, just say Andy. I think it's easier for most of you than to pronounce Andreas. That's a bit complicated. I'm Andy. I'm working for Eurofins since 2005, so since roughly 16 years now. I've been involved in different functions within Eurofins, and since 2018, so around 2 years now, I'm heading the Department of Packaging Materials in Hamburg. So I'm located in the northern part of Germany. I'd like to go for the second very large and relevant jurisdiction, which is the USA. I think very most of you I guess very most of you need to take care of both legislation, the US as well as the European ones, as of course the United States itself is a relevant market, and also as the US-FDA protocols is still accepted in a lot of Asian countries, and at least has the same reputation than the European protocol has. So I think it makes sense for you to be aware of both of these requirements. Yeah, here you see the Statue of Liberty and one of the Chinese ships entering the harbor of New York. I'm not really fully aware how the situation is in other countries than Germany, especially in the countries you are coming from, Pakistan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. But in Central Europe, the United States requirements were not really of large relevance in the past. So it popped up in the last couple of years that more and more products got a requirement to also fulfill the requirements of the United States. At least here for us in Europe, one of the main driver are the big retailers like Lidl, like Aldi, like Carrefour, who are expanding more and more also to the United States market, and therefore need to comply with the legislation in the United States. So what do we expect in today's afternoon? I would like to give you a very, very brief introduction into the legislation. So the framework. Oh, no, I can hear myself.
Yes, Khaled. Please mute yourself.
Thank you, Khaled. Thank you very much. Yeah, so a very, very brief introduction into the legislation, so which laws are applicable, the overview, and then I would like to give you an introduction, what evidence can we use to confirm that your packaging material complies with the FDA requirements. There is, on the one hand side, this is what we call as proofs and the respective exemptions for that, and the other side are the what I call the special proof or specific proof. Actually, these separation in standard proof and specific proof is something that is, I would say, my idea. This is nothing, nowhere written, so you will never find these distinguishing between standard and special proof. But I think it's valuable to have especially a focus on the standard proofs, as they are easier for you to comply with, they are easier to understand, and very most of packaging can by standard instruments be proven to comply with the US-FDA requirements. One disclaimer in advance, this one here. The presentation which I give you now is exclusively addressing the US regulations in total. So we have only very little legislation in single states, like in Delaware, for instance. So there are some countries, some states within the United States which have a food legislation in place, but in terms of the packaging requirements, all of the single member states like Delaware refer to the FDA chapters. So you can be sure that if you comply with the FDA chapters for the whole United States, you are also compliant with all of the member states within the United States. There is one little exemption with the California proposition. I think that most of you are also have heard about the California proposition 65. Actually, this is not a food or a food contact legislation, but this is more, let's say, a consumer protection law in general. For California proposition, I will give you at the very end of the presentation, I will give you a slight insight what it is about. So if we go for the, apologize, I did not translate Gesetze, this is laws. Gesetze is the German word for that, I'm sorry. If we go for the legislation itself, so which laws are applicable in the United States, we have two, I call this two benchmarks, two really fat red lines in history of the legislation. It started in 1938. In 1938, the United States used the FDA. This was for the very first time that there some legislation about food and drug came into place, and here is the content, the table of content of the FDA legislation. And what you can see here is we have definitions for food, for drugs, for medical devices, for food additives, and for dietary supplements. But we don't have any chapter and also no subchapter in this very beginning from 1938 dealing with food contact materials or with food packaging. This was not in place in the beginning from 1938. This came up in 1958. In 1958, this is the first of my red lines, of my great breaks or great innovations in the legislation. And it is important as we have an instrument, which I introduce later on, which is called prior 1958 sanctioned, so which was already in place before 1958. So what came into place in 1958 is that the FDA introduced these so-called famous Chapter 1 Codes of Federal Regulations. We will have a look into several of them later on. So these are chapters which give requirements, which defines ingredients, so which is applicable to certain materials used for food contact. As mentioned, I will introduce this in a bit later on. Also, in 1958, the FDA introduced the concept of GRAS. GRAS is an abbreviation, an acronym for generally recognized as safe. So these are substances which, easily said, which can be eaten. So they are extremely less toxic. They are of no problem at all. Ijas, can you please mute your microphone? Thank you very much. So in 1958, we have this general introduction of the idea of packaging into the food contact legislation in the United States. So the first very, very important horizontal line. And the second one, I mentioned we have two real breaks within the legal history. The second one was introduced in 1997. The reason is rather simple. These codes of federal regulations, which we will in detail have a look later in this talk, these codes of federal regulations, they are by definition laws in the United States. And these laws give very, very detailed requirements for certain materials. And you can imagine that these laws are extremely unflexible. So it needs to have a certain time until they pass the Senate and the Congress. The president need to sign each of these new laws. And especially as nowadays, you can imagine the president of the United States has other priorities than to deal with food packaging. So these instruments of the codes of federal regulation was very, very slow, and innovations did not really come up. And therefore, in 1997, the FDA introduced the so-called food contact notification system. These Chapter 21 of the Codes of Federal Regulation, they are still in place, but they were frozen in 1997. So no new entries into the Chapter 21 Codes of Federal Regulations. It is the status of these chapters kept on 1997. They were never amended, they were never or nearly never updated since 1997. So it will become much clearer when I show you during the presentation several examples, and I will explain these two red lines more often during the afternoon's presentation. But keep this in mind. We have 1958 introducing the chapter of Codes of Federal Regulation, and 1997 freezing of these chapters and introducing the food contact notification system. If we have a look into this law from 1958, you can see here a definition. And actually the definition is rather similar to what we have seen today in the morning about the 1935 in Europe. The term food additive, so the Americans called in the past a packaging as a food additive. Nowadays, they called it an indirect food additive. So I think it's a bit a better word, but we must keep in mind food additive or indirect food additive is a word in the US for packaging. The term food additive means any substance intended use of which result or may reasonably be expected to result in becoming a component of food. So this is extremely similar what we have seen today in the morning for Article 3 of the Framework Regulation 1935. So any substance which is by intention or for which we can expect that it will migrate into food is a food additive. We here in Europe, we call it a food contact material. They call it a food additive, but that's the same. The definition is fully the same. If a substance is migrating, then it becomes a component of food, and then it is a food additive. The other way around, a substance that is not migrating is not a food additive, and therefore it is not covered by the legislation. So in other words, if we can prove that you use an ingredient, let's say for a printing ink, and if we can prove that this substance in the ink is not migrating to food, so it is not becoming a component of food, then it is not a food additive and it is excluded from the law. So here we have something what we call a non-migration principle. As long as it is not migrating, it is not covered by the law. Okay, and then we have here an exclusion. Any substance which is generally recognized as safe, so this is the GRAS exclusion, then it is also not covered by that. And if the substance is used prior to January 1st, 1958. So this is what I mentioned earlier. We have the first red line. Any substance which was already in place and which was approved by FDA before 1958 is also accepted, is approved. You don't need to have a new approval for these very old substances. Probably the most important example for prior 1958 substances is the plastic material PVC, polyvinyl chloride. We learn later on in this presentation that we have for each polymer, for each plastic material, we have an own chapter in the FDA regulations, but we don't have a chapter for PVC because PVC held a positive approval by FDA already before 1958, and therefore it is prior sanctioned 1958. So in summary, a food additive, or what we call a food contact substance, is any chemical which is intended to a food or by intention which may reasonably be expected to become a part of food. And exemptions are prior sanctioned and GRAS substances. We have two exemptions from these very general guideline. The one is if you have a functional barrier. A functional barrier is a barrier which can reduce. Somebody has muted his microphone. Either a question. Do you have a question? Elsewise, please mute you. Yeah, thank you, Vivo. Thank you. This was the Americans. They are working quite a lot with what they call court cases. Court cases means we don't have law for something, or we don't have an FDA chapter for something, but we had a law case. We had a company, or we had FDA going to court and complaining towards a company. Let's say this instant here, Weinberger. Weinberger was an employee of the FDA in 1975, and he had a court case with Natick Paperboard. Natick Paperboard was a paperboard manufacturer, a paper mill. Weinberger from the FDA said the presence of PCB, of polychlorinated biphenyls, are fully unacceptable in the food additive, so in the packaging material. And the court stated in that case that if the food placed in, or to be placed in a paper container, which will be insulated from PCB migration by a barrier so that no contamination may be accepted, then it would not be a food additive. So any tight barrier between the food and the outside, whatever is outside, this can be a paperboard with a PCB, but this can also be a printing ink, or a complete outer layer, like a cardboard, for instance, where you have an inner bag. And if the inner bag is a tight barrier against migration, then the cardboard can completely be ignored. The FDA has a list of substances which are considered as functional barriers. Actually, this is nice that they have a list, but this is a very limited list. The one is aluminum foil. In general, any aluminum foil is considered as a functional barrier. And the second is PET materials. FDA has approved no other materials to be a functional barrier. To be honest, this is a bit a theoretical consideration, as in praxis, and this is also, I think, relevant for all of you needing to comply with FDA. In praxis, it is very, very usual that the FDA is only considering the primary packaging as food contact. So any secondary packaging is commonly not considered as food additive, and therefore it is usually not required to be FDA compliant for an outer packaging, for a secondary packaging. Yeah, and the second court case, this was against Monsanto. I think everybody is aware about the company Monsanto, a huge, nowadays they are manufacturing mainly pesticides for the agribusiness, and Kennedy was also an FDA commissioner. They argued about the insignificant amount. So the court at that case said this was about acrylonitrile, that any amount of substance is sufficient to make it a food additive other than it is insignificant. And insignificant was defined by what they call a Ramsey proposal. And here we find the 50 ppb limit. So 50 ppb is in the United States what we here in Europe has as a 10 ppb level. Everything below 50 ppb would not require a food additive regulation, or in other words, can be ignored. Every migration below 50 ppb. Okay, myself again and my team. And Natalia, I think we have a bit more of time. If there are questions, I'm more than happy to answer if possible.